on to the next point, which you engaged with Mr. Hooper on, started to anyway. And I just read you a note that I got from the private sector not long before this meeting, and it was talking about the concept of procurement. And it's the first note, so it was obviously held as a priority for them when they put these thoughts out. There's zero room for negotiation or working with bidders to improve their tenders, even if there's a better solution deal available. So, in other words, what we've got here is a political and bureaucratic process deciding what it wants and then saying, this is what we want, come in. But there's a massive iterative process lost there in terms of, and no disrespect to civil servants, but they may not necessarily know the latest thing in the market or what initiatives have been taken, what new things are coming along. And it migrates towards this design and build thing to some degree, which is at a fairly high level. What can we do together to get that process to start happening so that there's a learning culture building up in the contracting process? I don't think any of us, we talked about this before the meeting, I don't think we can see that at the moment. Your thoughts on that?
I would say that I understand the concern raised with you, but I wouldn't say it's a universal problem. We have a number of systems whereby we'll engage early with contractors. You know from one of your other committees, Mr. Robertshaw, there's a whole thing called early contractor involvement in the NEC framework contracts, designed very much to say, why did you ask us to do this? Because if we did this latest technique, we could reduce the price and we'd both be better off. So that early contractor involvement absolutely does happen.
So why is it a concern then?
Because that's a feature of the NEC contracts, which is for things, and we would use it for things like building a bridge, £1 million contracts, multi-million pound contracts.
No, I'm going down.
You're going at the other end of the scale.
No, across the board.
So you could, for example, have early meetings with potential bidders and say, we're interested in replacing this roof. Before we put out a contract, what sort of things should we be thinking of? But I think the problem that you've identified is one where the process is leading the practice, because if you've already published your specification and one of the bidders says, I don't think we should do A, I'd like to offer B, they know that by offering B they're not going to get any marks, because the marks are on how well you do A. So the officer putting that contract out, if he thinks B is going to be, I wish I'd known, that's a great new offering, it's going to cancel the procurement. Snakes and ladders, this one, they're going to go back down and start all over again.
So they're not going to then, are they?
So there's a disincentive, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So we have to find a way of putting, I'm going to yet again go back to the policy. What is the principle you're trying to achieve? Is it working really well with local businesses? Is it being able to demonstrate at all times that the systems are operated with complete scrupulous fairness? But Mr. Robertshaw, it's not the first time someone has said to me, you should be more like a business, you should be more like the private sector. So I would hazard to suggest that most times I act like that, somebody has a complaint, because it's not fair or it's mean or it's... And it is a difficult one to get right. And there are some things about the private sector we shouldn't be like, but the others, like responsiveness, quick decision-making, and getting on and working together, I think are laudable, and they're the sort of things I think you're aiming at.
Yeah, I mean, I promised the chairman to talk about the promenade. You props,
you did.
I did. I did. But
I'll hold you to it.
Thank you. So we'll generalise it and talk about how even your good self has recognised that in some of these huge contracts that either haven't happened at all for 25 to 30 years, like the Lord Street site, or the extreme criticism that some of us have offered towards the construct of where the harbours go, or where, dare I say it for a second and then move on, where we started from with regard to the promenade. You can understand a concern from somebody like myself seeing these big things not working the way they need to, and wondering then, well, how is it working at a more routine level, sort of contracts from $500,000 up to a few million? It's a worry. Do you not accept that people like me, representing the public, would be concerned?
Mr. Robertshaw, please don't for a second think I don't worry about it. I'm the accountable officer. It's my neck on the block, so of course I worry about it. Do I follow your logic that because the very big schemes are difficult, the smaller schemes must suffer from the same problems? No, I don't think it is. I actually suspect that there's an area where we have a high level of familiarity, a good level of competence, and good working relationships with our suppliers that routinely go well. You are looking, and the examples you mentioned, which I won't repeat the name of for fear of upsetting the chairman, were are schemes that are the equivalent of the UK's Crossrail, the UK's HS2. Although it's in another place, we've discussed it. We are using on one scheme almost all the island's civil engineering resource, both in terms of qualified labour, in terms of contractor power. There is only one civil engineering contractor not working on that particular scheme that we dare not mention the name of.
No, but stop.
And they're working on other DoI schemes.
You've said, I'm sure, and forgive me if I'm misquoting, you will quickly tell me I am misquoting you, the sense that had we started approaching this from a much more engaged level in the first instance, with regard to the subject I'm not allowed to discuss, then we might have been in a better place. Now,
there's a difference. So you are misquoting me because, or slightly misunderstanding me. There's a difference, Mr. Robertshaw. Our aim was that we did that early contractor involvement. It was provided for, it was intended, it was desired. What I've said to you previously that we did is we didn't spend enough time doing it. We didn't do it well enough. But the intention was that it was done. No, I don't think it is the same thing, because we aimed to work with the contractor to deliver the optimum output. We just didn't do it well enough. And that's very different from not even trying, which was your first example of, well, you don't understand the technologies available. I think they are very different things, Mr. Robertshaw.
With the harbour strategy, you didn't engage at the beginning with your consultant. You didn't with Royal Haskinen. You didn't start with them. They were called in their words, they were called in after you decided what you wanted to do.
And I suppose
true? That is true because it's on record.
We've established that previously, Mr. Robertshaw. But if you look at it in the context of this inquiry, then in a way we're back to specify something, you have to know what you want. So it's difficult to procure on the basis of we'd like something like this. And you've got a step below, or further than Mr. Hooper in his please fix my steam locomotive.
I'm not sure that's accurate, actually. I mean, if you look at the renewable energy pin that's gone out, the way that was approached was in two stages. The first stage was, I think this is what I want, tell me what you can do. Now they're assessing that on the basis of, well, now we're going to put a tender together that's based on all that feedback. So I think what Mr. Robertshaw is getting at is, in terms of the harbour strategy, for example, it would have made sense to go out and say, I don't really know what I need to achieve here. This is what I think I need to achieve.
We did exactly that, Mr. Hooper. We put out a pin. And a pin is the low-risk, light end of procurement, as you've
So why then are you saying that actually you wanted to do more that didn't work? Surely that's the process.
We identified the sort of things we thought were appropriate, and then we said to the consultant, come and talk to us about these things. So Mr. Robertshaw is right in that we did give the consultant an outline of what we wanted. He's absolutely right. I'm not disagreeing with him. He recalled the situation that was agreed in a previous committee. But it wasn't that we started from that. We started from a pin. And we asked people what ideas they had to contribute.
But your consultant ultimately said on evidence that had he been asked at the beginning to do this, he wouldn't have done it. That's what he said.
Yes, he said he'd have offered different solutions, didn't he, in practice?
Right. OK, so then you talk about Lord Street. I came into politics hoping that I could help to make something out in Lord Street. I'm retiring from an old farm now, and nothing's yet been done, and we're 25 years in when other people have done huge things. You can analyse all 4 weeks or 5 occasions where something should have happened and didn't. It falls down in each case in the interaction between an individual department and the potential contractor. So that again shows that there's a misunderstanding, or again, the concept of Mars and Venus. It's different language, different approaches. Surely from all of these things at a high level we can learn lessons and then presume that these similar sort of things are happening further down.
So to try and put that in a slightly more focused way, actually, I think it's a really good point that what I've seen happening elsewhere within procurement, take for example within the way digital contracts are procured, partway through these larger projects there are review points, so they'll do sort of a gateway review if they think something isn't quite working, and at that point you can decide actually this isn't working, we need to pull the plug, we need to change suppliers, we need to do X, Y, Z. that doesn't seem to have a similar process when it comes to capital projects. So, for example, if you have lots of problems with, say, the promenade, at what point would you have stepped in and gone, actually, maybe the problem isn't fixable because we didn't spend enough time consulting at the outset. Maybe we need to take a step back and rethink our whole approach to this. At what point do those kind of gateway reviews happen when it comes to a procurement process like that kind of size, that kind of scale?
There used to be a gateway point at every point in the 10-step capital project process.
There are a whole range of gateways in the capital process, because at each one you need a yes-no decision to keep going and keep going. And there's a difference, I think it might help your committee to just perhaps bear in mind, that the difference between the very rigid governance of getting from your specification to the award of a tender. But once you've awarded that tender fairly, you can then negotiate, and as you quite rightly said, Mr. Hooper, you can go back after 6 months and say this isn't working now. And as long as that doesn't undermine your original award, then variation is possible.
But what I mean is there are circumstances where you might say, we've awarded you the tender, we're 6 months in, this isn't working as we think it's going to work, actually we need to stop, we need to pull that and we need to start this again, we need to get somebody else in to do this, not just varying the contract. You might be saying, actually, turns out you're not the right people after all, you've overpromised and underdelivered. So I'm assuming there is that kind of process in place for capital. Can you just maybe advise us that the last time that decision was taken to say, actually, this isn't working as intended, we have to pull and start again?
It is a very major decision to terminate a contract. You'll know that there was a major housing scheme in the south of the island where the contract was terminated. I think it was perhaps many years ago now. That was before housing came back to the department, so just around that time, probably 6 years ago, something of that order. I can provide details to your clerk, but perhaps best not to mention some of the names involved because it was a difficult time. But effectively that contract was determined. There is a scheme that is currently being constructed, which isn't a departmental scheme, but as provider of project management, I'm aware that there's a consideration that we should determine the contract and say, you really should have finished by now. You haven't given us good reason why you haven't finished by now. It doesn't appear to be due to coronavirus. It doesn't appear to be due to anything else. You're just not on it. And consideration is being given absolutely now to determine that contract. But it's a very major step financially. To get something X% through and then to invite somebody in to finish it, whether it's an IT project or a construction project, is challenging. Certain people would rightly have complained if we'd stopped the prom halfway through, left it in a mess and said, well, we're going to spend another year finding a new contractor.
I get the complexities, but it just seems that given we spend circa 70 million a year on capital projects, that actually it doesn't happen more often. We know there are lots of problems with the way things are delivered. There are constantly complaints being made around the way we deliver and the speed and all the rest of it. It seems very strange then that actually government isn't more robust in that space of saying, look, if you're not delivering to the contract we agreed at the start, we're moving on from this. We're going to determine the contract and...
But that actually takes it to another very important area, and to some extent, on one hand, you appear as, and I apologise for lumping you together as a committee, to be saying you should work with people, you should build things up with them, you should be in partnership for the long term and the good of the island. On the other hand, you should manage every line in the contract. So with some of the contracts we have, you can either work in partnership towards a good outcome for everybody, or you can say, that's a compensation event, we owe you this, you owe us that, and you spend all your time arguing about the detail. The NEC contract suite, which I'm no way an expert in, was designed to try and avoid that situation where you built the thing and spent the next 7 years in court arguing about who owed who what. So there is a process of ongoing discussion of, that took us longer, you didn't give us that in time, you failed to do that. And both the client and the contractor is present at those discussions to say, does that allow extra time? Does it do this? Does it do that? But ultimately, we can determine or vary, and in the case of another big project, we have done those things. Should it happen more? It would be regrettable if we did, but it would be also regrettable if we should but didn't.
Mr. Black, a lot of what you said there seems to be sort of quite recurring themes. How do you demonstrate that not just the department, but maybe government, but I suppose I keep it to the department because that's your area of responsibility, that actually the department is a learning organisation, is actually learning from these mistakes, and because they seem to be repeating and repeating and repeating, but with different people. How can you sort of demonstrate that to the committee that actually the department is learning from these?
As I think you probably you may have received a letter from the Chief Financial Officer recently about a review of procurement. I believe there's something due very soon. I'm not privy to the details, but in checking before I came here, I asked if there was an update, and I believe that there's something on the way. We regularly join in. We are asked by colleagues in chambers, colleagues in audit, colleagues in other parts of Treasury, how's it working? We've put our feedback in. So there are always issues in the process that we can learn. I absolutely agree with you. Some of it, recently I asked questions on these two bits of the rules appear to contradict. Could I please have clarity? And I hope that will be reflected in the next edition. So we are always working with colleagues to do that. When it comes to the learning of individuals, do we have a framework whereby the person placing contract A sits down at the end of it and says with everybody who might be doing on B, C, D and E, I did this, perhaps not as formally as we should, but there's absolutely, I'd agree with you, that there has to be some way of capturing.
And I don't believe that there is a mechanism, is there, that captures the experience, and because we could have much longer capital procedure notes potentially is one way of doing it, then there may be other ways of doing it, but at the moment I think it's just a struggle to the committee to know how it's being captured, how knowledge is being shared, how the mistakes learnt by someone in one area are actually sort of translating into a learning experience elsewhere.
One of the ways that I'm confident we are doing those very things, Mr. Chairman, is that as you know, the delivery of project management has been moved into DoI several years ago, and one small team is doing the project management for a large number of the bigger schemes, and that absolutely is a way of sharing it. They're all working in the same area physically. They're all working for the same senior officer. They are very much sharing their understanding, sharing their knowledge. They're working across schemes, across departments. They're picking up what's good in one area, translating it to another. Could I give you a piece of paper with the monthly reviews on? Probably not. I think there's informal learning. Could we do better? Probably we could.
So there's no formal review at the end of a big project. You don't then go back, formally review it.
There are projects. Yes, our major schemes have effectively close-out projects, meetings, reviews. Yes, that's done. But in terms of getting the learning as we go through, I think we're less formal, which I think is the point that the Speaker was asking. Sorry.
Okay. Can I just ask, what process is in place now, and who does the value for money committee work that used to be carried out?
So that used to be within Treasury.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's ever gone to.
I've not had we've never had any part in the value. I mean, obviously.
So I think perhaps the capital projects unit was that what you alluded to?
Was part of the old capital project. The CPU was in Treasury, and that became our project management unit.
Is that what you mean?
And we're again working with Treasury colleagues to make sure we've got that balance right.
So there's a gap in value for money reviews at the end of projects.
There's the danger area, I suspect, Ms Edge, is that if you put all your resources into delivery and take them out of governance, you risk potentially not having enough governance. If you put all your resources in governance, you're probably not going to deliver much because there's nobody doing the job. And the balance has to be struck, as I mentioned earlier, between the level of risk. And, so if it's a high-risk project, it will definitely need some governance, and in some areas that could be strengthened potentially through a value-for-money committee-type approach. You're absolutely right, Ms Edge, and whether that's a reformed CPU or a reformed value-for-money committee or enhanced scrutiny by your committee, so there is that. But our efforts, as you know, are focused on the delivery of things. The governance tends to be something that is a Treasury function.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, thanks. Just come back to this point again about the iterative process that should somehow be going on between supplier and purchaser. And I started by identifying big areas, which we've discussed and we won't go back to, but before we moved on, what I'd hoped to do was to say, well, how can that translate to lower level project numbers, $500,000 upwards. What we're asking here is, what are your thoughts on that, to stop it just being what the private sector is saying to me, which is, no, it's very process driven instead of being iterative. Now, it's not an easy question to answer. I just seek your thoughts on this.
I think that our best contracts are the ones where people work closely together. I think that makes sense, where the if you like, the officer charged with securing the supervision of that contract is not firing off letters saying you failed to clean the corner of classroom 32, but is going round with somebody saying, I think you need more attention here, I think you've missed this, why aren't you doing this, and it may be a shortage of this, it may be a shortage of that. So there is that learning process as we go through those contracts. But I know that my colleagues are always concerned about being accused of being somehow too close to the party that they're meant to be contractually managing.
This is the challenge that we both need to face here.
And how do we avoid saying a situation where, and you'll all have heard it, oh, so-and-so will get that contract because they're mates with so-and-so. You absolutely will have heard that. And I have to say that it is incredibly rare that there is anything criminally wrong with our procurement processes. You've identified areas, all of you, where we have not done well enough. But this is not an organisation where people are taking cuts of the deal or backhanders or brown envelopes. I don't see that as part of the world that I work in.
No, I think you're being defensive. I was looking for your comment, your positive comment.
And the balance, Mr. Roberts, was how do we encourage people to work with, to learn from and share with? Because if you were my contractor, I might learn something from you that you'd picked up in another part of your work, or at a professional conference, or the exhibition of the latest in, I won't choose any of your examples, but you know what I mean, the latest in X technology. Whereas I might say, yes, but my experience is that this is lacking, or that is lacking, or you could perhaps offer this. So we could have, but surely we're back then to the long-term contract relationship with the learning points specified, with quarterly or half-yearly or annual reviews, with flexibility and potentially the ability to vary the contract at some point. So you say, well, you've not done that, so we're taking that off you. So if you look at that scheme that we don't discuss, we have removed from the contract certain elements that we believe will do better ourselves.
But, Mr. Black, there'll be a wide spectrum of contracts managed by the DoI between that cosy relationship, that close relationship, perhaps rather than cosy, close relationship between the DoI and the contractor, and those that are relatively arm's length and are sort of contractual elements. Whilst I'm sure you're swimming in feedback, do we actually go out and survey suppliers, especially in that sort of small local space, to obtain their views about improving the system? Because whilst you might get feedback when things seem to go wrong, and again we talk about how we actually build that into a learning system, but how do you actually go out and sort of actively seek that feedback, and how?
Yes, in some areas.
Which and how, I suppose?
So, for example, in construction, my colleagues regularly attend things like the Construction Forum. Only 10 days ago, a supplier to us doing a very small piece of work said, Nick, have you got half an hour? I need to talk to you. And he came and said, look, you're making this difficult for me because of A, B and C. Do I really have to, or can we find a way round? Now, I said to him, thank you for giving me the opportunity, thank you for telling me what's going on. We were able to resolve it quite easily. In fact,
they've approached you, and what I'm trying to say is, in fact, the good news is it had already been done, and at the right level. Because literally while we're talking, somebody phoned and said, it's all sorted, don't worry. At that broad level, we engage with our construction suppliers primarily. We have good relationships, and that's an industry with good representation in an organised way. Yes, and if you look at the contracts I'm most familiar with, yes, I speak to the supplier and say, are we doing this right, are we doing this wrong? They might say, oh, the design's been slow. We might say, well, why do you keep asking for so much? But we have those discussions. But just to finish off, sorry, Mr. Speaker, I don't go to Mr. Mercedes and say, do you like the way we buy buses from you? No, and I somewhere in the middle, I suppose, construction is going to be high value and frequent engagement.
For us, yes.
Yes, it's the best of the rest, really. Not quite as remote and unique as sort of dealing with an international corporation about the purchase of X, Y, and Z, but maybe your hedge cutters or that at that sort of level, to try and sort of get that feedback from small local businesses. Do you actually reach out to them in what way?
When I ask, for example, colleagues involved with cleaning and caretaking work, and as you'll know, there's recently been a change in some of the responsibility there. Again, when I speak to them, I very clearly get the idea that they know by name the key people in their supply chain, that they know the firms who will do that and won't do that they're constantly in touch with them, they're helping each other out. If one can't deliver, they might change to something else. So I would struggle to evidence it to you, but you didn't ask me to. So do I think it's happening? Yes. Is it happening always? No. Will it always be appropriate? No. Is it an area where we should think further? Yes, I'd agree with you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's an area we could look at again.
Some of my questions related to big contracts. If we can sort of go down into the more routine stuff. If I asked you, do you think your department acts fairly? I'm sure you're going to say yes, but naturally. But as far as suppliers are concerned who feel that they may not have been treated fairly or want to exercise their concerns, some of the feedback I've had in this area has been, well, we don't want to express that because if we do, maybe that will prejudice our position in the future. What thoughts have you given to that to reassure that type of concern in terms of them having the confidence to say, well, actually, have we been treated fairly here? Nick?
There's two aspects of fairness, Mr. Robertshaw. Perhaps my initial answer would surprise you. I'm not as convinced as maybe you'd imagine that we are always fair. One thing that worries me, which is not directly related to this, is the way we pay people, and particularly smaller businesses can wait quite some time to be paid. We are getting better. Our finance shared services colleagues are absolutely helping us, but I worry that people can send in a bill and wait some time. So
how long?
We aim to make sure that everyone's paid within the month, but for a very small business, which might have in its term, our standard days are 20. Our standard terms are 28 days. But for small businesses that need to be paid every week because they've got a cash flow problem, that's a worry. One of the things that I've also been successful in trying to achieve through our contracts is the ability to balance off what we're owed and what we owe. It is quite frustrating signing off very large cheques to people who owe us very large amounts of money. So we've had to make sure that and offsetting, it would be normal if we were talking about if I owed Mr. Hooper £10 and he owed me 20, we probably wouldn't swap a 20 and a 10, we'd just swap the 110. In our world, that's not provided for unless you put it into the contract. So we have been putting that into contract because that's fairness both ways, isn't it? That's fairness to the taxpayer, who shouldn't be providing cash flow for businesses, but similarly, nor should we be taking up the cash flow of small businesses in particular. So that's an area to work on. I have heard the issue you raised before. I'm not going to complain because I won't get the job next time. I hope that's not true. I understand the fear. Would I be more than happy for people to approach me and say, I don't want so-and-so to know, but I'm worried about? Yes, absolutely I would. Do people do that? Not on this issue, not on procurement. I've not had that raised with me. I hope that people will come and see me if they feel the need to.
Well, I'm saying they don't because not because
they're afraid,
anything, but because they at all, but simply because I might be prejudiced in the future. That's an understandable concern in a small community like ours, where certain contracts can be.
I agree with you, and we've had a number of cases of appeal recently. And for me, that won't change the way I perceive the firm if they bid again. If their appeal was successful, something we did must have been wrong. That's not their fault if we got the scoring wrong, or if we gave too many marks for one thing and not enough for another. If we made the error, that's not their fault for saying, I think you've got it wrong. So why would there be any sort of consequence for them? But how would we deal with that issue of fear? We'd have to end up with some sort of confidential reporting system to a third party, so maybe they could, clearly they might write to you, for example, and say, could you raise this on our behalf without disclosing our name? And then
it becomes difficult.
It becomes difficult because I would immediately say to you, well, what business have you got representing that company? Have you got their consent? And you say, oh, well, it's difficult. I don't want to tell you who it is. So you can imagine how difficult it would be for us.
That's my point.
Yes, it is. I don't think people have any need to be afraid. At the lower value, as you know, at the sort of couple of £1,000 range, then we are dealing more with an individual person with individual relationships. Because if I wanted, if I wanted a small bit of painting work, I could phone firm A and firm B, and as long as I wrote down both prices, I've passed the threshold of the regulations. But in your world, I might say, well, I'm not phoning firm C because last time I did, they had a moan. And they spoke to Mr. Robertshaw, and then he came and gave me some grief. So
I try to do that regularly.
I'd like to say I hadn't noticed, Mr. Robertshaw. There's no oath taken. So, but Mr. Robertshaw, I understand that, and how do we fix that?
Well, I'm asking your thoughts on it. That's what I'm asking.
I think we fix it with a culture of fairness, and my colleagues work in public service. They're not there for their own benefit. Yes, we're great. We're blessed to have good jobs at difficult times, but the people that work for us are doing good things for their community. They are helping their community. I don't think we employ people who would say, "Oh, I'm not phoning him again." There might be a few, and that's more about our values, our culture, the example I set, I think, than it is about rules. Because they surely have to go together, don't they? Because we only need rules, either where there's a lot of risk or where we've failed. As Mr. Chairman said, well, we write bigger financial regs. Wouldn't that be a disaster? That would say we have collectively failed to do the right thing because we want to do the right thing.
So how is fairness measured if some of your workers who are handing out contracts are heard to say, "I hope my favourite contractor gets it"?
Ms. Edge, it's really difficult because I've got, and I'm trying to be careful with a phrase like favourite contractor, because it comes back to the chairman's accidental use of the word cosy, which illustrates exactly the point we're trying to make, which is how do you develop a good long-term relationship with a contractor who you know will do the right job at the right time for the right price? The person who, and you can imagine this domestically, and you know something about from your past role about contractors working in large environments, you want the one that turns up on the first day of the holidays, not the one that turns up on the last day going, "Sorry, I was busy." You want the one
That's the responsibility of the individual given the contract out to manage it.
I accept that, but if you're making 2 phone calls, would it only be natural that you phone the 2 people who did a good job last time?
Shouldn't be.
So then,
because you're trying to get best value, and best value means getting a good quality at the right price. So if you know that there are 3 firms who could supply you, and I'm trying to use different examples at the risk of, so I don't upset anybody, but let's say joinery in this case. If you wanted some joinery done in a property, and you know there are 3 joinery firms who could do it, 2 have done a great job at a great price, 1 of them previously messed you around, let you down, shoddy job, called them back 3 times, still wasn't happy, which would you call? You know what you'd do.
So
we're trying to get the best value for the taxpayer. So where does fairness balance with value? And it's Mr. Robertshaw's question again, how do you do it?
So why is the department giving individual full-time paid invoice work to individual joiners rather than going out to contractors?
So are you suggesting that what we're doing is we're employing contracts for services rather than contracts for service rather than for services?
Yeah.
So we're effectively employing subcontract staff.
You've got...
The only
How many have you got?
Pardon?
Have you got a few?
How many joiners?
Subcontractors working on a full-time basis.
Our list of subcontractors is endless. How many people are we employing on the basis that we're effectively treating them as our employees, which I think, as you're saying, I wasn't aware that we were doing many, but I know that we're struggling to recruit in trades in particular, and it would appear to me that it might be that my colleagues are saying, I'll have a joiner for a week, and I'll tell him what to do, and I'll equip him and direct him. But that translates a very different risk to us, because we're then the employer.
This is Paul Wilson.
Just on the point you made before about the 3, are you talking about a preferred supplier list there?
If it were a high-value contract, you would do a preferred supplier list, and then what you'd do is a mini competition. So that would be fine, because you'd have a small, short process. You'd have scoring metrics, and you'd say there's 3 people on our list. I think the example I was using with Ms. Edge might be £1,000 worth of joinery. Whereas, as you know, go back to the page 28, I think it was, with the spreadsheet on, for low-value items, on rare basis, you can make 3 phone calls, get 3 prices, write them in your notebook, and that complies with the regs.